So this morning, I'm calling this sermon, this is a part of our sermon series on Saul. This is a tale of two kings. This morning we're going to talk about Saul, but we're also going to talk about the second and upcoming king in Saul's life, and that's King David. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and what happens here is this is the story of David and Goliath, and I'm going to go into a slightly different focus on David and Goliath because I'm sure that everybody here has heard the story multiple times in their lives, read the story themselves, probably done some research on the internet, probably had some pastors or Bible school teachers who have talked to them about all the important points. This morning, I'm not going to be going over that. This morning, we're going to talk about something in here that is happening to these two kings. At this point in time in the history of Israel, Saul is king. That means he is the leader of the armies. That means he's the leader of the people. And so the king goes, the people go. And you're going to see that in a moment. But David at this point in time has already been anointed the next king. Saul is told that the kingdom is going to be torn from his family, meaning God is removing it from Saul because of his ignoring the word of God, ignoring the purpose of God in his life, and going his own way. So God has removed this position from Saul. I'm going to read this in a narrative style, so I'm going to be commenting. So if you have paper and pen, you may want to write down the points. This is recorded because I'm going to be going into something here that most preachers try to stay away from because it's taboo. Or someone might say it's heresy, but hopefully today we're going to look at something in your lives completely different than you've ever looked at it before. Chapter 17, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Succoth and Azekah and Ephesdammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped on the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. Now these guys have been fighting for some time. The Philistines haven't been defeated yet. The Amalekites have been defeated. King Agag has been killed. And Israel is on its way to becoming the nation that God has ordained it to be 1,000, 2,000 years later. That's what God is doing here. He is taking this people that He has promised the Messiah will come through. And He is taking them and He's preparing the future for them. Unfortunately, these wars have to happen. Because otherwise, like you're going to see with the Philistines, they would just wipe out Israel and take everything they have. So God has to preserve the lineage. So these guys have been fighting, but what happened is they're now set on two sides of the valley. They're set up in battle array, meaning one side can't just go attack the other side because their defenses are that strongly embedded, but they are at war. Now, verse 4. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span, roughly 9 foot 9 inches tall. The guy is taller than the door right there. Okay? That's his height. If you do a basic body mass index of 30, he's going to weigh in just under 600 pounds. His shield that goes on him is probably over 100 pounds. His chainmail that he wears, which would have been armor that goes from the neck past the groin, would have weighed in at about 91 pounds. Not to mention his shin guards, his arm guards, and his helmet, probably somewhere around another 100 pounds. He carried a spear on his back that the spearhead weighed in at about 16 pounds. So the guy had to have been a brute, a massive man. As they say in here, of the Philistine army, he's the champ. Nothing is going to beat Goliath. And he knows it. So here we go. Verse 5. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, 91 pounds. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. That's the transfer there. The translation there. And he had bronze armor on his legs and bronze javelin between his shoulders. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed in at 600 shekels, roughly 15 to 16 pounds, and a shield bearer went before him. That's the guy who carried the shield. Then he stood and he cried out to the armies of Israel, and he said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle?" Meaning, why? What's your point? I'm here, I'm going to defeat you. You cannot win. We're going to crush you. Please just die in front of me. That's basically what he's taunting them with. Don't go on. Don't keep fighting. Just give up. You're nothing but dogs. He says, "Am I not a Philistine and you the servants of Saul?" What he's saying here is, you're a bunch of slaves to King Saul. Now remember what we talked about in last week. King Saul was a head taller than everybody around him. He was a big man. He wasn't a strong man. The Bible tells us that he's a slender type of guy. But nonetheless, he was a big man. His stature stood out with all of Israel. Why are you servants of Saul here? Why are you servants of God even here today? Why waste your time? Don't you know that I'm going to crush your lives into the ground? And we're going to take everything you own. That's what he's saying. "And you, the servants of Saul," verse 8, "choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." Stop for a second. Okay, so King Saul is the leader of the armies. Who makes the commands for the armies? The king does, right? Doesn't your leader, your general, your top general, he makes the calls. He says, "This is what we're going to do," and everybody carries it out. Well, you know what? Goliath was so evidently endowed with authority that he walks out here and he says, "I'm going to call the whole war off. If you kill me, all these people on this side are going to be your slaves." That's pretty big. Where's the king over the Philistines? Because if I was king, I'd be going, wait. We're not going to throw the whole war away just because you might die. Who are you? I'm Goliath. And I'm standing in your face. And not even the Philistine king's coming against me. Because I'm even going to crush him if he gets in my way. That's who this guy was. See, we sometimes don't understand what stands before us. The enemy that stands before your life, the obstacle that's in your way, the thing that has just came in and devastated your life, and I don't care what it is, insert whatever you want. Sickness, disease, divorce, whatever. Loss of job, loss of a loved one. That cancer diagnosis. Whatever you want to sit in there. Verse 10, "And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we might fight together." In verse 11, "When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." You know why? Because he's coming to the battlefield with all of it. All the clout, all the authority, all the power is on his shoulders. And there's nobody on the Philistine wall over there going, "Yeah, if he dies, I'm going to do what," you know. They're not stepping out to fight. They're leaving it all to Goliath. Now David was a son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. And the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third was Shema. Here's the deal. Jesse just sent his 3 firstborn sons to war. See, that's a serious thing in Israel, because your firstborn is the one that gets all your inheritance. If something happens to the firstborn, then you give it to the secondborn. Okay? But essentially what used to happen was the greatest was given to the firstborn, and then the rest was broken up. He sends his 3 top sons. That tells you how important this war was. It was serious. That Jesse says, "Go on, boys. Everybody else has got to fight this fight. You're going to." Now it says he was old and he was worried about his sons. Let's keep going. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself for 40 days, morning and evening. For 40 days he's down here telling the children of Israel how worthless their God is. How terrible it is that their lives are going to be crushed. They're going to turn into slaves for the Philistines, and they're going to take everything. For 40 days this went on. Listen, when you get the bad news from the doctor, you get it one time. You go for a second opinion, and you get it a second time. At some point in time there, you now have to sit down and say, okay, I have to fight this thing. I have to deal with this thing. Could you imagine hearing, you're going to die from 40 doctors? Don't you think you'd be pretty just crushed inside of the energy, the fight, everything's gone? You can't even muster. Why do you even get out of bed in the morning? And Jesse said, verse 17, to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. And now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. See, the fight isn't over. They're actually actively engaged the enemy. They're just not making any headway. They're not going anywhere. Saul's hiding in his tent somewhere, trying to figure out a plan. And David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shout for the battle. Verse 21, for Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper and ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers. And as they talked with him, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words that he had been doing for 40 days. I add that in there. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. Fear had overcome Israel. The people who were called to defend and secure Israel's future and to secure the lineage of Jesus Christ. Jesus wasn't there yet. This is thousands of years before. The people who are supposed to go forth, as God said, and set the way for the Messiah, were dreadfully afraid. Verse 25, and the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king, will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house as exemption from the tax in Israel. Let's stop there for a second. Saul has gotten so desperate at this point in the game. What he is doing now is he is saying, I will give you a portion of the king's gold. That's pretty serious, right? Because the king was the one who owned everything. He took care of all the finances. He made sure that the people had jobs, had food, had security. That was his job. And they paid taxes to that, just like we do today. Things ain't any different. But then he was going to give him his daughter. Now what that meant back then was, if I give you my daughter, we're united forever. The family's houses will never be at war. Because if I go to give you my most prized possession, my daughter, that means we're like this. We're blood. So now David, who's been anointed king, is now going to be joined with the current king. That means that the people that are behind Saul are not going to raise arms to David. Now see, you got to be thinking about David for a minute. He's thinking, wait a minute, I've already been anointed king. This is going to happen at some point. Saul's here. I'm already singing to Saul in his house because he's being tormented. He's got some screws loose, some bolts missing in his noggin. So I'm already there. If I marry his daughter, then I'm in. This is happening. I think there's a little bit of motivation in David. Verse 26. David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? That's interesting, the reproach from Israel. I'm not going to get on that. I don't have enough time. But here's what he says. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? See, David knew who God was. David knew who the army was supposed to be standing for. David knew who the king was supposed to be standing for. Saul didn't, evidently. And the people answered him in the manner saying, "So shall it be done for the man who kills him." Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against his brother David, and he said, "Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness?" That's my brother beating me up. You know you're nothing but a little sheep guy. Go take care of the sheep while the men fight this war and die for God. That's what he's saying there. David, you're the youngest. You got nothing in this fight. We know what's going on. We're going to defeat these guys as best we can. We're going to figure out a way. Go home and deal with your little sheep. I know this is a little long, but stay with me here. I know your pride and insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see this battle in verse 29. And David said, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" Did he not see a reason to stand up and fight? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as first ones did. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for them. See, David wasn't leaving. They sent to Saul because they're saying, "Get this kid out of here. He's your singing guy. He's your guy who makes you happy when you feel down. Get rid of this guy. Kick him out of here. He's making all the rest of us feel worthless out here." And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Wow, there's a good thing. David's about yay tall, and the Philistine giant's 9 foot 9 inches tall. That's probably sounding pretty good to Saul. And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth." He tells him straight up, "You're not able to do this." He is a man of war from his youth. But David says to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went out after it, and I struck it, and I delivered the lamb from its mouth." Israel is going to be delivered from the mouth of the lion, from the mouth of the bear, and David's going to do it. Stay with me here for a minute. "I went out after it, struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing as he has defied the armies of the living God." Once again, David knows who he's up, who his armor guard is. He knows who his warrior is in front of him. He knows who the warrior is behind him, and it's God himself. Moreover, David said, "The Lord who has delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you, big boy. Go." When you're standing in front of an obstacle, the biggest voice you're going to hear is your family members going, "I don't know what we're going to do without you. I don't know how we're going to make this happen. I'm sad to see you go. We love you. Hope the cancer treatments go well." Is that the kind of family you want around? Well, that's what David had. That's the family David had. So, verse 38, Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested it yet. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. And he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Verse 41, so the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. I want to stop right there for a second. These two men, one young boy, probably filled with some idealistic things in his head. He defeated a lion, he defeated a bear. Maybe they were both small ones, you know. But anyway, in his head, he thought that he could do this. The man from the enemy's side is coming down, and he's saying this is a walk in the park. He's actually insulted, as we're going to go on here in just a moment. He's actually insulted at some point because David is so puny and pathetic looking. But you know what David knew? And here it is. David knew that Goliath was created by the living God. Now get that in your head for a minute. Here's this man who was born a Philistine, who was raised as a man of war, raised to hate whoever the king said it's time to hate. God made Goliath. Do you get that in your head? God made Goliath. God made Israel's enemy. See, most pastors or preachers, they won't tell you that, because what happens is in your mind you start thinking, well, okay, so God created evil. God didn't create evil, but what he did was he created a man who became evil. Well, wait a minute. That means God's evil. No, it doesn't. Here's what happens. God created Goliath. He was supposed to be this monster that stood up and said, for God, I'm on God's side. But Goliath turned against God. Every single one of us has a purpose and a calling in this world for God. Goliath was born and made by God. His stature, his size, his height was given by God. We can't add an inch to our head. Has anybody ever tried to do that? I want to be 6'9". I want to be like the pro wrestlers. I want to be that. You're not going to be. You're going to be who God made you to be. God made Goliath. You got to get past that. God made your enemy. Ouch. Can I say that? God made your enemy. God made your obstacle. God made pneumonia. Oh, wait, oh, Ben, you can't say that. Of course I can. Of course I can say that. Because it's truth. Don't believe it? Then you're the heretic. If you can't believe that God created it, then you're the heretic. Because it says in your word that nothing that was created without Jesus Christ. Nothing. That's what your Bible tells you. So that means Goliath, who's standing in your face, who's telling the whole world, who's watching the two biggest armies come against each other, who's telling the whole world, your God is nothing. He's meaningless. He doesn't know anything. He can't help you. Nobody is going to come down from heaven and stand in my way. That's what he's saying. God created that man. God created the very thing that's keeping you from your purpose in God. God created the very thing that stands and sucks the life and the energy and the vibrancy right out of your bones. God created it. But you know what? There's a glory to the story. Because if God created it, God knows how to take it down. See, the Bible tells us that God does things in a way that we can walk with him and we can be in victory with him. And he knows that this fallen world is going to choose through free will to go its own way. And Goliath could have been a model for other people around him to stand up and fight against tyranny or fight against obstacles or fight against an enemy. He could have been on the other side of the valley, right? Goliath could have said, hey guys, I know I was born a Philistine, but you guys were all wrong. I'm going to the other side. Did Goliath have that right? Free will says he did. Goliath could have said, you know what? Last night I was thinking about it, and Israel is the chosen people. I'm not going to fight against them, and you're all going to back down. Remember what I said early on. He had the authority. It was on his shoulders. He's making a declaration, you defeat me and we'll be your slaves. He's taken the position of the king of the Philistines. He has that power. He could have stood out there and said, we're not going to fight. David, I made a major mistake. We are all created in the image of God. Let's turn this army around. Let's set in to the future that God has for us. But he chose not to. And God created him. And what's interesting is, in a minute we're going to read something about David, what he does. David, I think, knew this. Because here he is. He's got the best armor that Israel created, because he's wearing the king's armor at the time. He's got the best sword that Israel created because he's got the king's sword. Right? He's got the best helmet, the safest helmet to wear in a battle. He's got it because he's got the king's helmet. The king has the best of everything. And you know what David says? I can't fight in this. Let's go on. Let's close this up. God created Goliath. He created the worst thing to ever stand in the face of Israel up to this date. Verse 44, and the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. And listen to this, whom you have defied. Judgment just fell on what God created. David stands before him, and he said, this is what he's not dealing with the Philistines. He's dealing with the enemy in front of him. He's dealing with his obstacle in his life. And what he says is, you obstacle have defied the living God. You obstacle have came here and you have defied your God. Because he's my God and he's your God too. And this morning, judgment falls on you, Goliath. This day, verse 46, the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is God in Israel. What he did right there was he just spun the judgment. The Goliath cast at him. You see that? He spun the judgment. Listen, Goliath. You come here to feed me to the birds of the air. I'm going to prove to you something. That judgment's coming back on you. I'm not going to sit down and let the enemy abuse me. The enemy has already been crushed. Your word tells us that. Jesus, he ended it. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was then that the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and he took out a stone, and he slung it, and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. David killed his obstacle with something that man never made. Did you see that? He didn't kill him with a sword. He didn't kill him with a gun. He didn't kill him with a truck. He didn't run over him with a slew of horses and a chariot. And all that he might have been able to pull off. What he did was, he went down and he took something from the earth that God made. Because he also knew that God created Goliath. So God, you created that. So this you made, this will take that down. And Goliath fell to the power of God. He did not fall to the power of a man. He couldn't have done it. Really. You're going to hit a man who's wearing a shield on his head, a helmet on his head, with a stone this big, from across the battlefield. David took down that which God created, that turned around and defied God, with something that came from God. That's how you need to start looking at your situation. No matter how bad it gets out there for you. You're losing your home. You're losing your car. You lost your job. Your wife left you. Your dog ran away. We mock that and make fun of that sometimes, but the reality of it is that's our lives sometimes. And sometimes it really gets that bad. You don't have a pot to go to the bathroom in. You ain't got a bed to lay your head down on. But you've got a stone from the living God and the obstacle that he created. Friend, today, whatever that obstacle is, the enemy is ready to fall, and God is ready to take him down, and he knows just how to do it. Let him do that for you today. God bless you. Have a wonderful week.